when I came across this phenomenon of short-term events in city spaces, and you see city beaches, that one in Paris, a temporary shop in London, a temporary park in Brussels, and a garden festival in Glasgow, which is, in a way, an older form of temporary construction and use of space. So how do I make sense of this? And this was triggered by a Guardian journalist who contacted me to ask me what I thought about it, and I had to think about it. So I've been thinking and doing some work on that. So the way I want to make sense of it for this presentation is to look at these two sets. On the one hand, look at the agents, and I split them into private, public, and social, knowing that there's a lot of overlap. So don't take that to be a very clear-cut separation. But broadly, we are talking about people who are driven by these particular roles of monetary, regulatory, and experience of the city. And on the other hand, I look at how each of these groups may or may not have these different intentions of being pragmatic and interim or experimental or trying to maximize the use of the place. And I explain what I mean, going through them. But just briefly talking about those contexts, context of technology, globalization, state restructuring, economies that are driven by consumption, culture that are diversified, social inequality that is rising, and deep recurring crises of global nature. So the first set of considerations is what do private sector people want and expect from temporary uses. This is a little bit of information about the extent of economic impact on the shop vacancy in the UK. It went up dramatically. And high streets are in trouble because of online shopping, because of supermarkets, and because of this deep economic crisis. So there's a lot of space. There's a mismatch between supply and demand for space. So you have too many spaces, too few activities. And this is something that Berlin experienced when it emerged after the unification. So they've been in Berlin very entrepreneurial and innovative about how to fill these spaces. But this is a challenge. How do you fill spaces? And one of the ways of doing that has been through thinking about short-term rents, short-term activities. So you see a lot of that happening. The owners want to obviously let their properties to fill it with some activities, so they are willing to be flexible, and the users are making use of this. Developers, on the other hand, want to fill the space while the land is not being developed. So this is a gap between when the market is not correct, not ready for a development. This is from Croydon, South London, and a big space is available for development, and the developers get this firm of landscape architects to do something there. And this is a piece from the architecture writer of Observer. And he's very impressed with this scheme because it says the landscape architects want something richer than lobby landscapes and pointless trees. And so they designed cricket grounds for refugees. And if you go to the website of this landscape architects, you see they say we are emphasizing the local flora and fauna, and we don't want to do, it is an alternative Chelsea show. And of course, the bottom, you see the comments by people, readers of Observer. They say 99.99% of people who pass don't notice this. They don't see this at all. And when you go to the website of the developer, this is what you see. There's no reference to that local identity, local flora and fauna, cricket grounds. Basically, again, it's one of those corporate designs. So it is an interval. It is filling the gap while the market picks up. So temporariness here is that element of interim. There is an element of experimental use in temporariness as well. And here you see there's London pop-ups, and all sorts of networks have been set up to fill those retail spaces that are left empty. And they use it for market testing, promotion, and branding. And the quote I put there is that it is a great hook, a pop-up shop, to use to get press for your brand. And that's why you see also, this is advice from Northern Ireland Business Development Office, and they say, behind the hype, short-term retail is a proven method of product promotion, brand awareness, and market testing. And if you have a new business, you can test the market by something temporary, just being very careful and cautious not to invest too much, and then the owner is not putting a lot of risk by giving it to you as well. So it's a kind of mutual testing of the waters, as well as a brand promotion. And now you see, this is the sort of thing, if you're a small business, startup business, or land that is left empty, interim use is a way of coping with crisis. But this is then transferred into a cultural trend. And that's why we see these big names. They are not suffering from any shortage of money, but they want to ride the cultural trend of temporariness. So you see Chanel and Bob Dylan and Coca-Cola and Clark's. Apologies to Bob Dylan to be included here, but he's been used here as a kind of brand. And IKEA, these are all big names. And they are using temporariness as a way of showing that present. And there's the Claridge's, for example, had a temporary restaurant. So this is a trend rather than a necessity. And then the third, if you are a private person trying to survive, and this is the scene in many cities around the world, in many African cities, the primary form of economy is survival economy, the street trading, livelihood operators. And they are basically living a short-term living opportunity. They are on that edge. So it's a mismatch between places and activities, but it's the other way around. There are too few places and too many activities, and they don't have access to proper spaces for their activities. Now, I was listening this morning, and this is a picture from the city center of Newcastle that has been turned into this place of experience. And this is, if you visited British cities a generation ago, you wouldn't see this sort of activity. So this is a maximization of the use of space. Public spaces are being used for experience. I was listening to the news this morning, and a new shopping space opened in Leeds, and the developer was talking about curating experience. And that's a very interesting term, that you curate a museum and you curate a shopping mall. And that is the sort of creating the sense of experience, and that's the experience economy. So a lot of these temporary things are making an experience, are part of that element of turning the urban space into a space of experience. And of course, with a commercial intention and character. And the same space is turned into this. And with this would have been impossible to imagine city center of Newcastle to be turned a place of Coca-Cola in that explicit commercial character. This is the core of the city, and these are nice Georgian architecture in the city center. And you're familiar with the festivals that go with this retail, and this space of Regent Street is turned into this sort of experience that takeover of public environment by short-term events in support of commercial activities. And then, again, the survival aspect of street food, this is again from London, but not to that sort of luxury qualities of Regent Street, but this is in Tottenham Court Road, but same sort of street food trend that animates the urban environment, used as animation, but at the same time, it is a form of survival for some of these people who are running it. Now, when we go to the public sector, so this was a little bit of seeing what private sector might want from it. If you go to the public sector, what do they want? I mentioned Glasgow. I don't go into the Glasgow because it's a long history of how it happened. But that also was part of this issue of coping with crisis, having too many spaces with too few activities that you need to fill. So the event of Garden Festival was a catalyst. So the public environments, public authorities use it as an interim use, The bottom, the two examples are temporary parks in Newcastle, where a space was post-industrial space on the quayside, left open, left vacant, and used temporarily as a park in waiting for the development, which happens on the right-hand side there. Then public authorities also use events and short-term events, again from Newcastle quayside, for promotion, re-imaging, and rebranding of a place, in the same way that private organizations use that. So this place that nobody wanted to visit, for example, is turned into a change of image. So people know there's this quayside that you can go and visit, and there are possible enjoyments to have there. And of course, it becomes a catalyst for investment and regeneration of the place. But again, this turns into a brand. This is from our university, and our university is not using it for any particular purpose, but the pop-up language and imagery is then used for just an extension of our library for a short period of time. So the short-lived events, pop-up language of expression, all become part of a cultural trend. So there is gap between and links between necessity and cultural expression. And this is another form of cultural expression that shows that short-termism, and I have many more examples. I cut them all because of the shortage of time, but this is the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square in London, where it is not being used for a permanent exhibition, but for a short-term event, changing public artworks. Now, if you look at the link between this and planning, is an interesting linkage. On the left is a diagram from the Urban Renaissance book, and how it advertises and promotes the use of master planning. On the right hand is a quote from a conference in Vienna about temporary uses of space. And they say temporary use is a critique, is the opposite of master planning. It is small events, and it starts out from the context and current condition, not from a distant goal. It seeks to use what already exists rather than inventing everything anew. In a sense, it's a step-by-step, bottom-up, as they imagine it. So you see the strategic form of planning, which is master planning in that sense, is contrasted with this sort of step-by-step, which is an idea expressed a long time ago in planning theory. If you are familiar with that, in Lindblom's quote that I've got here is incremental idea of planning, step by step rather than long-term visions. And it was expressed in Christopher Alexander's ideas of how to plan. Basically, his book of 1987 is an anti-plan urban design manifesto. So in a sense, these are ways of thinking incrementally, step by step, rather than having a plan. Partly and largely because you cannot foresee the future. The future is so contingent, so unpredictable because of all these big crises and events that you cannot manage or control. The third item of a public authority is maximizing the use of space. This is from the city centre of Nottingham, and these are quotes. I examined the PhD done on temporary uses of space in Nottingham, and these are fascinating quotes by the planners of the city. And the first one is the most astonishing. He says, this public space of the middle of the city is private property. We rent it out on a rental basis. So basically what they see is as the opportunity to maximize the rental income of the city from public environment. And that's what was part of these street food networks and animation of the city center. If you read Porter's review of how to rescue the dying high street, she says, think of the city as a retail space. Think of the public environment as a retail space. And that is what the public authorities are doing. And that's why the short-term events are part of that framework of dwindling budgets and necessity to earn. So this is the last group that I'm going to talk to. A lot of young people enthusiastically, energetically put their efforts into these short-term events. What do they want from it? One possibility is that they are looking for opportunities to fill these empty spaces. And there are interesting examples. This is from Guardian that suggests that we can use these shops for becoming community hubs. So it's in an interim use. It's coping with crisis. And there are too many places, too few activities. How can we bridge that gap? And the social groups, artists, community groups find this as an opportunity to use. And some of them are very actively using that, these spaces. And that's one of the things that, for example, you see a lot in the city of Berlin. And this is from Newcastle. One of these empty spaces was turned into a pop-up film school for the summer for some youngsters. This is a case from Paris where the space between two buildings was left empty for a long time, and some community groups are turning it into a community garden, and it got a prize from Public Space Europe Network. But also, at the same time, you see the precariousness of short-termism is the precariousness of life on the street. So the life on the street is growing in that sense of people living on the street. And it's the same city of Paris. Now, the experimental use of public spaces and short-term activities is this case from Brussels. This is a firm, my friends in Rotterdam, they've got a firm, and they got this scheme in Brussels. What they did, they worked with the local groups. This was one of the traffic circles of the city. And they wanted to keep that way. But local groups wanted some playgrounds and pedestrianization, and the city would not accept that. So what this firm of designers with the local communities do is that they take over the street, take over the space, pedestrianize it, and create a temporary park here, basically illegally. And then the council is worried, and they just let it be. They don't touch them. And for a while, it works, a couple of months, and they see that the traffic adjusts itself. So they let it become a public park. And so it's one of those temporary events that is not paving the way for something else. It is paving the way for itself to be established, which is a kind of experimental and innovative way of using it. But there's complaint, and this is from Greater Washington area, that they say the landlords and regulators are not equipped to handle temporary uses because they do. Basically, landlords think of long-term ownership and control. They're not so flexible usually, and regulators are the same. It's a bit of a struggle for anybody from that frame of mind to think so short-term. But the maximization of use of space, you can see with adding layers and textures in public art, in garden, guerrilla gardening, in graffiti. All of these add layers and textures. They are cultural expressions, but they are cultural expressions of short-term, accelerated urban life, in a sense. The American entry, 2012, in Venice Biennale, was this. 300 and something cases of these short-term events. And they called, this is from their website, provisional, informal, guerrilla, insurgent, DIY, hands-on, informal, unsolicited, unplanned, participatory, tactical, micro, open source. These are just a few words floating around to describe a type of interventionist urbanism sweeping through cities around the world. And the same website, they accept all of these acts might be gentrification by another name. So there is a subtext to all that. The community groups who are do-gooders and go to local areas for edible gardens, for community gardens, and when they leave, the gardens disappear. Or what do they do to these environments? Do these events come out of these local communities and environments, or are they introduced to them by outside forces? So this is my, if you like, sum up. You see the agents on the right-hand side. They are coping with crises, extending market operations, and are looking for a more intensive use of assets in the private sector. Public sector are also coping with crises. They use it as a vehicle of restructuring. It's an expression of their transition from a public mindset to a more private mindset. And they are facilitating development. And in the social sector, there is this creative potential, but also at the same time, it's a normalization of precarity, of short-termism as a way of life. On the left hand, you see the intentions that they have is interim, which is pragmatic filling of the gaps, the market gaps. The second one is experimental. They are looking for transforming things. It's a catalyst for change, testing possibilities, challenging conventions, as the case in planning, and a catalyst. But also, it's a kind of way of maximizing the use of assets. But in that maximization, there are some serious challenges to the public nature of things, activities, and spaces. They add textures and layers, but how do we see through these layers and textures that are added to the public environment? Do we see underneath that what is at work? For example, I should be finishing, but I'll just give this example. In Wembley in London, when you see an area that is advertised for a whole year to be given free, an article in a newspaper, free space for the artists and creative types for a whole year. Fascinating. When you go in there, of course you have to pay rent, but not a huge amount of rent. That's fine, that's very good. But then when you read the story of the development of this site, these were offices that were abandoned and they were sold to a private developer who is now taking this opportunity to maximize the space. So many times more the usual density. They've taken the permission to develop at heights that are completely out of scale with the local area and at prices that are out of range from the local population. So the basic story of this development is a transition of land from public to private hands, giving them ability to develop a lot more, therefore maximizing their rewards. But the presentation of this is providing opportunities for a few people to use low-rent spaces within a year. So it's a kind of legitimizing a process of development. Of course, the process of development is also legitimized on the basis of London needs housing and let it happen. So there are many layers to these stories that need to be unpacked and analyzed and understood. So this is the actual very last slide. On the left, some of the broader themes that come out of it, that this changes the social and temporal organization of the city. It creates ambiguity in spatiality. It's an inductive, empirical, and market-driven process, and it combines creativity with precarity. And on the right hand is the book of mind that I've written on these matters, and a lot wider discussions about temporality, cities in time, which is coming out in February. So if anybody's interested in reading it more about this sort of thing, that's what I would show here. And thank you very much.